locally, but all around the world. So Bronwyn, if I could invite you up onto stage. Hand of applause for Bronwyn.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn.
And the clicker too.
Super.
Presents, thank you. Yes, as per the introduction, I'm both a futurist and an economist. I work in the public sector. I work for the UNDP and also in the private sector doing research like this. I've actually just completed a youth research study in terms of macro trends with the UNDP, but it contrasts in some ways and also reinforces some of the trends and insights that my organization, Flux Trends, picked up alongside Student Village when we went and did this research study that I'm going to distill for you today. We called it the 30-30-30 project because what we did is we did 30 really in-depth interviews with 30 young South Africans under the age of 30, in other words, the born-free or Generation Z generation, who are just about turning 30 this year. They are in your organizations, you have to deal with them, they are your future customers, and they have some differences compared to the way that people engaged with businesses, engaged with corporations, and engaged with each other compared to other generations. There are also, as I said, some differences in our local context compared to the global context, which I will also talk you through. But to give you a sort of snapshot as to where youth are at the moment and why it's important to pay attention to them, is we've picked together a whole lot of signals and a whole lot of insights, and we've come up with 3 essentially macro themes that speak to this particular generation. And why is it important for you to understand this if you're working in the customer experience or customer management space? Well, it's important because data and automation can only help you automate what you can analyze, what you can see. You can't automate an insight that you haven't taken notice of, and you can't automate a process that you haven't programmed. And there's so much richness and nuance in the world around us that we can only really understand once we get face to face with our customers and really understand the things that they haven't told us in surveys, or the things that perhaps your processes might not pick up because you're simply not looking in that direction. So anyway, to get to the 3 key themes that we've identified with this generation, they're a little bit in contrast with each other, but really once you look at that whole big picture, it does seem to start to make sense that they're not quite as in contrast with each other as it may seem. The first part is that of apathy, this idea of not wanting to participate in the big projects of our age. The big projects specifically being that of democracy and so-called capitalism. Not that they necessarily understand what either of those words mean in practice or in theory, but this idea of not wanting to support systems that don't match with their own personal ideals and that they don't seem to be able to win at. So we see these trends all over the place, locally and globally. Globally, there's a quite well-known movement called the lying down flat movement. Originates in places like China and Japan, where young people simply don't want to work. This has reflections and ripples on the other side of the world, where we see trends like minimum effort Mondays in terms of employees that want to do the least amount of work possible, or in lazy girl jobs, where young women on Twitter will help each other find a job, usually in the HR department, somewhere where you can just show up just in time, get away with doing the bare minimum, maybe type a few emails that won't dent your nails, and still earn a good enough salary to be a consumer in their spare time, essentially. But this is incredible. I mean, a Generation Xer, someone around about 50 years old, would be quite horrified at that, right? You have to make something of your life. You have to at least have a career that fulfills some of your goals. That's not the case. What we'll get to as we get more into the professional space is that they are seeing a job simply as a means towards their consumer existence, not as a part of their self-identity, which is quite interesting. We also see, of course, apathy in more serious issues, less relevant to this conversation, but still relevant from a total context, because businesses operate within a society, and we see large amounts of apathy towards democracy, towards showing up to votes in elections. We know this. And this, of course, doesn't add towards social stability. It does add more uncertainty into the world of business. So we have to pay attention to this, even if it's not part of our day-to-day analytics that we are busy monitoring. The second key aspect of this generation is that of anarchy. So hands up if you recognized that particular scene. A few of you would have. It was in the news quite a lot over the last couple of years, actually. That was a snapshot of one of the organized instances of anarchy and nihilism arranged by the so-called, again, not really organized, a more disorganized group known as the Latwizi, which essentially are young people who organize online via various different hashtags and agree to just show up and protest, well, nothing in particular, right? This is a protest without a purpose. It's just showing up to cause chaos. So this is the sense of anarchy and nihilism, which again is more active than the apathy conversation, but it's action in no productive means. So there are parallels there. The good news is that social research shows that this is a smaller percentage of the group, but still you also find this in terms of, say, customers online who want to cause trouble for brands for no particular reason. The customers who get together with brand hit lists, for example, and just decide to mess with your algorithms online. That's a thing. It's a hobby some young people have. To deliberately make your adverts show up in the wrong sort of places by engaging with ads that they have no interest in really responding to. This is happening. This is out there at the moment. The sense of anarchy, nihilism, disruption of society is something to pay attention to. Quite different to the last group, which is another form of active protest, but here in a more positive, directed sense. So we have to be balanced in our assessment of what's coming with future generations. We shouldn't be too holier than thou when we look at it. And it has to be said that this generation, when it comes to activism and actively engaging in politics, has perhaps had more success than previous generations in shifting the needle around conversations from climate change towards youth involvement in political ideas, all the way through to sort of more active consumer activism or investor activism. So I'm going to pick on Mr. Mark McVeigh there, who is a young Australian, not a South African, but a young Australian, who successfully sued his pension fund for investing in petro-based companies. So you might say, oh, he's just an environmentalist and he's like disinterested in the capitalist project. He's perhaps part of that apathy or the anarchy side of things. Not at all. Mark successfully sued his pension fund because he pointed out that by investing in those old assets, in the old economy, the petro economy, it was having a negative impact on his investment returns. And I think this is a really interesting signal about the cleverness of his play, but also how, in contrast to the millennial generation, which is becoming more liberal as we age, I'm part of that cohort, Generation Z is becoming more cynical and more capitalist when it comes to actually living out their actions. So here's the first insight for anyone in the consumer space. Other generations traditionally lie to survey organizers or to market researchers to make themselves feel good about themselves and to give the right answer. So if you were to ask a millennial how they plan to invest their, say, retirement funds, which stocks they're going to buy, that millennial will tell you they're going to invest in ESG stocks, they want to purchase products that align with their personal values. This generation will no longer even tell you that. They will tell you that at the same time they might have social justice values, they plan to invest for maximum personal returns. And we're going to see that theme coming through quite a lot. So people do lie. What we think about consumer values doesn't necessarily play out in terms of their purchases and in terms of what they actually want at the end of the day. So let's get into a bit more of the research that we did in our report ourselves, some of the things that are coming out. Again, I'm going to start with the one that's probably most relevant to your work in the customer experience space, because this has an implication in how you track your customers online and how you personalize their consumption journeys. And that's this idea of identity being faceted or fragmented. In other words, your customers show up differently in different spaces. This includes in the office too, which is really interesting from a marketing perspective because we've spoken for so long about things like hyper-personalization and knowing everything you can about your customer and showing up in different places for that same customer. But here we have a very big contrast, again, if we want to compare like the millennial generation with Generation Z. From a millennial generation perspective, when we were at university at the sort of dawn of the social media internet, we were told a lot about personal branding, making sure your personal brand was consistent across different platforms. You're encouraged to get professional headshots and have the same picture across all your different social media platforms, and to make sure your personal brand was always talking about the same sort of things, however you want to build your career or your startup. It's shifted now. Now what we find is people show up differently in different spaces. Perhaps the easiest way to understand this is about how we show up at work. Again, older generations were told, bring your whole self to work. Show up as your whole self. Work-life balance was about taking work home, but also about bringing your whole understanding of yourself to the workspace. This is no longer the case. People don't want to bring their whole selves to work. In fact, they don't, because, as we've said, they've already checked out of capitalism. They're cynical about the companies they work for. You're only bringing your work brain to work. You're not bringing all your other talents. Instead, you've got a side hustle for that, right? So you're separating your identity. Again, in terms of how we use social media platforms, becoming more faceted. Almost, to use an analogy from another industry, like self-sovereign identity, in the age of corporate and national surveillance, and in the age of blockchains and distributed ledger technology, we are able to show up differently in different spaces and only show or reveal data points or personality points, increasingly, about ourselves that we want to show in certain spaces. It's a much more cynical, much more self-aware way of engaging with the internet and with different platforms. So, for example, with the young people we spoke to, they're going to say, I go to Facebook to engage with my parents and my aunties, so I dress modestly. I wear pictures only of myself wearing clothes all the way up to the neckline, and I talk about Jesus and the Bible on Facebook, right? But on LinkedIn, I'm showing up as the person I want to be in terms of my side hustle career. I'm showing up as an influencer. I'm not talking about my religious or my family identity. I'm only showing up as this aspirational side hustler that I want to be. Likewise, on LinkedIn, you're showing up cynically to get a job. Those personalities are not schizophrenic. Rather, it's separated. Very much like, again, the idea of self-sovereign identity, that you're able to verify who you are and your credentials, but only those credentials, in order to get access to whatever good service or opportunity you want to access. This means that a sort of homogeneous, hyper-personalized marketing campaign is no longer going to work because people are showing up differently in different spaces. It gets even more complicated when we start to think about things like literal replicas of oneself, the idea of having agents that people can employ to further certain objectives in certain places that are under their control, but are not actually a full representation of who that person is or what they need. Just in that note, there was a report that came out in April that spoke about how, in terms of human versus non-human traffic on the internet, only 50.1% of internet traffic at the moment worldwide is by actual human beings. The rest is through bots of various different likenesses. Increasingly AI-powered bots, but quite often still manual clickbot farm type bots, the ones where you've seen the many cell phones laid out in sort of warehouses in Bangladesh, where one person has control over hundreds of phones and is able to really distort your traffic. But the point here with this faceted identity that we're getting to is that not only do we have to separate real and fake, we also have to separate the different aspects of our customers and try to make sense of what that whole picture is. That's going to take a whole lot more kind of piecing together, because underneath all of those facets is the same human being with the same needs and the same desires, showing up in different spaces at different times and playing a deliberate game of reveal and conceal for the businesses and individuals that they engage with. The next thing we can move on to, which is perhaps slightly in contrast to what the previous speaker was talking about, is this desire for in real life experiences. Again, this is something we've picked up with younger people more than older people. And in real life experiences could be something as simple as getting a fridge magnet from the likes of Yappy Chef as part of your customer experience journey. But sometimes it also requires physical spaces, like we are right here today. If your entire customer experience journey could be automated, well, you probably wouldn't be here physically today. That obviously took effort to get here. It consumes resources, but we still find value in that. And young people in particular, we find, are valuing that. A large reason for that is the general sense of loneliness across the world that has just accelerated since the COVID lockdown days, where we are seeing that young people across the world, around 1 in 4 of them, a quarter of them, have no friends whatsoever. So that's young people. Older people too, stepping away from our research for a second, are desperate for in real life connections, to the point that supermarkets in Europe are reopening human checkout lines where they had previously put in very efficient self-checkout lines, specifically for old, lonely people, and they are employing patient cashiers to literally talk to their customers, which is just a sort of an aside that at the end of the day, no matter what you're selling, you are selling to a flesh and blood human being, and that there's a lot of value to be tapped into there. So automation can give you efficiencies, but there's sort of deeper value and profit margin to be had, and perhaps not always optimizing for efficiency, but sometimes optimizing for depth. Similar to that, but not quite in the same direction, we've got this concept of deep ties, which is a sense of competitive advantage for South Africans, for South African communities, and for South African families. When we talk about deep ties, we're talking about how, despite across the world, more and more people being more and more lonely and isolated, largely due to the efficiencies of the hermit consumer economy that we live in, which has, let's be honest, been a $600 billion shift from out-of-home consumption towards in-home consumption globally. So e-commerce is working. But at the same time, what South Africans have that other communities don't have, that is something to consider in your marketing strategies, is this idea of deep ties. South Africans are still deeply tied to usually their family members at a multi-generational level. This means that people do have support networks in real human format, and it's something that is highly valued, which we'll come back to again in a second. But we can also move on to the next insight here, and this comes back to the cynical customer activist idea that I was speaking about earlier, and that is that although customers are increasingly making pragmatic choices when they come to their own consumption, they still have very high social justice barometer standards for brands, businesses, and public figures that they may or may not be supporting. So at the same time, they might purchase the cheaper product from Shein rather than the more ethically made, sustainable, handmade garment from some market in Cape Town. They expect the brands they support to have ESG standards at a very high level, and they are not afraid to effectively destroy those brands, often online, again with those both human and more automated brand attacks, for brands that don't live up to those social justice standards. So with that in mind, we can move on to the professional life of what's going on with young people at the moment, and back to this idea of pragmatism over values when it comes to themselves. So as much as they're holding brands up to high social justice standards, when it comes to their own selves, they are quite happy to cynically work for a company that does not reflect those values, as long as that company is paying them more than the more ethical company. Same thing with brands. They might be prepared to publicly denounce and harm your brand or business for not living up to their standards, but at the same time, they might still buy from you if you are cheaper. They're just not going to brag about it. Again, the sense of separation, the sense of ability to separate your values from your price, right? Which is really quite something to see. So you can see some quotes here. I won't go through the quotes, but if you're interested in that, I will give you a QR code at the end where you can read through all of this. But there's a whole idea of, do the ethics of your company work for matter? It's worth considering. Only if it doesn't hurt me personally and my own personal pocket. Now, of course, this is the sentiment that many of us hold privately and have acted on as older generations. But what's interesting here is that these guys are admitting it quite openly. And this, of course, also translates into their loyalty towards the brands and businesses they work with and buy from. There is very little sense of company loyalty in the lazy girl job, minimum effort Monday world. Make no sense about it. It's a purely transactional relationship from the side of the employee. Interestingly, we can also layer on top of that this idea of digital disconnection in the remote work and work from home world, which does break down those social norms and loyalty ties that perhaps would have had some of the rest of us getting into the office really early and staying really late in order not to let our teammates down. This is because we had human-animal pack bonds with the people that we worked with, which is very much lacking here. Relationships, very transactional at the company level, and by the same token, we also see this in terms of their relationships with brands. Brand relationships, there's no such thing as customer loyalty anymore. As my good friend John Sills from the Foundation, a very well-known UK-based customer research agency, will say, customers don't have loyalty to brands as much as you might think they do if they're wearing your logo or purchasing your product. Instead, when he does his research and digs into what actually drives loyalty, is customers are loyal to the personal relationships they have within your company. So the customer is not loyal to your software or to your product. They're rather loyal to the sales rep that they have a relationship with over time. That's where loyalty really sits when you get into the data. And when it comes to things like brands, we're also seeing, very interestingly, a very big difference between Generation Z and millennials in terms of their relationships with brand as a part of their personal identity. This is being very much disconnected. When it comes to even things like fashion choices, many of them would prefer to wear unbranded or ambiguously branded clothing as opposed to big, garish logos. This is an emerging shift, but definitely something to pay attention to. It might not just be to do with values, though. There's also very real cost concerns at the moment. And what has come through very strongly, both through our research and globally, is that increasingly basics are becoming the new luxuries. There's a whole lot of social media trends about, I'm not going to buy clothes this month, I'm rather going to go and splurge on getting actually fresh fruit from the supermarket. They've been jokes, but they're actually quite serious too. And when we look into the wallets of the young people that we spoke to, they are saving up for basics, saving up for fridges rather than overseas holidays, for example, or spending larger portions of their income on basic foodstuffs and basic goods. This means, from a business perspective, that if we actually want to grow our businesses in the future, we need to kind of make sure that our future generations are gainfully employed and making money so they can actually buy from us. Because South Africa is not immune from the aging, degrowing population macro global trend either. We think we live in Africa, so there's lots of people. Not quite the truth. In South Africa, our birth rates are just above replacement rate. Population growth in the future is going to come, if it does come, from migration. And that means we really do need to look at making sure young people have money to pay for our services going into the future, or we're going to be in a lot of trouble when it comes to growth. Growth can't come from pre-payday loans and from buy now, pay later services as much as they can help you in the short term. It's not going to solve long-term growth challenges for businesses. I like this quote. Luxury purchases are getting pretty boring. Regular life is basically now a luxury on its own. And that really summed up the sentiment of a lot of the people we were speaking to. But to continue on with the more sort of sermon part of my lecture today, we can move on to their relationship with the public. And this comes back to that critical first theme that I mentioned, that of apathy and disillusionment. And there has been discussion in South Africa when it comes to young people and their commitment to projects like capitalism and democracy. Is it a case of apathy or is it a case of disillusionment? And research points pretty strongly in the direction of actual apathy rather than disillusionment. In fact, the most disillusioned generation in South Africa is Generation X. That's around about the 50 to 60-ish-year-old people. Many of you in the room will fit that definition. They're the most disillusioned, but they're not the most disengaged. Young people are actually not that disillusioned. They had very low expectations to start with. In fact, for a lot of them, their expectations for the future have been surpassed. So they're not really disillusioned, but they're still not very keen to participate. And this is really interesting, but also quite scary from a commercial and from a public perspective. When we presented the initial results of this report, we presented them alongside a panel of young people to challenge our ideas. And when challenged about their lack of participation in the democratic projects and even in the companies they worked for, they were like, well, we're waiting for the old people to die. And our counterpoint to that was you're going to be waiting an awfully long time because, life expectancies are growing dramatically. So what are you going to do for like the next 30 to 40 years? And they didn't have many answers. Which brings us to the next challenge for those of you in the room. Again, we are diverging a little bit away from the customer experience topic, but there's still a challenge here in the room that most of you are leaders in one capacity or the other, and that's what is sorely lacking at the moment. Leadership in the home, leadership in the office, leadership at a state, national, and international level. We don't have credible role models. What was really interesting is that it came through, there was quite a desire for matriarchal role models. This could also be a hint in terms of the sorts of influences, the sorts of leaders that you put out in your marketing communication. But this idea of matriarchal role models doesn't literally mean female role models. Rather, it means a more feminine, more empathetic style of leadership. Or as Bronwyn Ayres, the co-author of this report with us from Student Village, said, what people are looking for is momagers rather than managers. That is, people who will help them dress and help them with etiquette and help them with more than just the work in front of them, with a more empathetic but still strict way of looking after them. So they are looking for leadership. They are uninspired as to where to be headed because there are no visions that they feel are worth supporting at the moment. Huge opportunity in the workplace and in society at large there to invest in empathetic but still strong visionary-based leadership going forward. And I would say it's probably the same thing when it comes to our marketing communications too. Our customers are just as lost and just as looking to be led somewhere that's going to be worthwhile them going towards. And the last sort of point that I'm going to close off with today, just because I think it's kind of compulsory when you talk about the economy and the future, and that is their attitudes towards, again, climate change, coming back to these ideas of pragmatism versus values. There was a very interesting gender divide here. All the young women are very concerned about the climate. The young men, not quite so much. But nonetheless, the climates, in terms of the vibes, in terms of the markets, in terms of politics, in terms of the actual weather, are changing, with or without really any of us. And to close off with, I thought that it'd be worth thinking about what young people think about the future ahead, their own place in it, and our country too. And what was one of the most positive things we took away from this whole exercise is that as much as they are cynical about brands, about country, about large ideas like democracy, they still have a high degree of both optimism and agency within themselves. And that's certainly something to be positive about.
Oh, I would just like to answer for myself only and say I'm optimistic about my future. I wouldn't speak much on South Africa, but I really do have hope in us. I do.
And do notice the way she's lying down while she is answering our questions, right? Just to tie that all together. But thank you very much for joining me on this journey into very literally what is our future. And if you want to get any more of the insights, they're available in a massive bumper report on that link. You've got an executive summary if you don't want to read all 200 pages of it, but there is a shorter version there too. But thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bron. Before you go off stage, first of all, I'm going to ask Bronwyn a question. I found your presentation fascinating. What was the disorganized protest? Letweezy. I could relate to that. Yeah. So when I was a little kid, there was a very well-known brand, and every time I went to the store, they would treat me poorly. You know, if I was there without my mom. And so every time I went into the store, I would go to all they have like an aisle of hi-fis. Remember when they used to sell hi-fis for the 50 and 60-year-olds in the room? So I'd go put the volumes up on the hi-fis when they were off, so that when they opened the store the next day, it would create havoc in the store. That was my protest to bad customer experience.
You had a
organized
cause,
protest.
you had an effect.
On a serious note, you spoke a lot about generations. Generational theory, I imagine, comes up into a lot of the conversations of people in the room. Is generational theory applicable to a South African population where we're not economically homogenous? Like if you're in London or New York, everyone's more or less within the same economic spectrum. If you take a place like Sandton or in Johannesburg, you'll have people being born into the richest square mile in Africa, and just 4 kilometers away, people have been born into abject poverty. Are those kids born into the same generation?
Well, those sorts of generational theory cohort studies is definitely something that is part of our thesis at Flux Trends. I would say yes, absolutely, it does make sense, but it's not from a demography point of view. We're not talking about statistics of how much people earn or how often they get married or whatever those cases are, though they are influenced. What we're really looking at is the differences in mindsets between generations and how they are differences at different ages. And that's where the breaking points are really interesting. So the best example there would be the millennial generation as a cohort, even though it extends from the late or from the 1980s up until the mid-1990s. That cohort is the only cohort in modern history that has become more liberal, more left-leaning in their politics as they've got older. This is not applying to Generation Z, and it hasn't applied to other generations either. And as to why that is, you have to look at the common events and that are increasingly common at a global, not even just a national level, that generational cohort has lived through. So the millennial generation was a generation that, when it comes to that expectation, optimism equation, very different. This was a generation brought up in the booming 80s and 90s and promised a prosperous life, and yet they own less property than Generation Z at the moment, or than older generations. They struggle more in their careers because they graduated into the 2008 financial crisis. This was a global cohort experience they all lived through. Generation Z in particular, and that's how we focused on this generation so much, they've actually had two watershed bookend moments that sort of coalesce them off as a class in and of themselves. South African context, they were born into a very literal watershed. That was 1994. That was when the youngest of them were born, right? And they graduated into COVID lockdowns. This was essentially an unsocialized generation, which has never happened before. That's your most formative years. The years when you're supposed to be going to college if you're an American, or going to university as a South African, getting your first job, wherever you are in the socioeconomic spectrum, being 18 to 21 years old, not surrounded physically by your peers, is going to set you up very differently to future generations, right? So you look for those watershed instances that make very, very big differences in the mindset of how those generations approach the world. And that's when you can start to sort of connect the dots and get insights that are hopefully relevant to how you address the needs of those cohorts.
Perfect, lovely explanation. Bronwyn, thank you very much for your time
Thank you.
and for your presentation. Round of applause for Bronwyn.